over to hand things over to Logan, our resident bird intern.
Sweet. Thank you, Nora. My name's Logan Anderson, and tonight I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite groups of animals, amphibians. I'm from Virginia, and there's a lot of salamander species down there. It's kind of where I got started with a lot of my amphibian kind of hobbying, and I'm really excited that we're going to be hosting the big night this year, just as a chance to be able to get out in that first nice warm night in spring and see some amphibians. Um, but to start us off, I'm going to talk about what is the big night. So I mentioned that it's the kind of the one of the first warm, rainy spring nights. You need temperatures above 40 degrees, typically both during the day and at night for a couple of days, and then you need a nice rain that either lasts most of the day and into the night in order to get these amphibians moving. You also need a small snowpack and some ice-free pools. I was walking Bald Hill Road this morning and we're not quite to the conditions yet, but I think give it another week and we'll be getting close to around when I would expect the big night to happen. Um, yeah, and to bounce off of that, like what is going on during the big night? Well, we have all these amphibians and they're moving particularly during this time of the year because they want to get to these vernal pools. You can see right up here we have a little pool, and these pools are typically full of water for only portions of the year. And the amphibians are migrating to these pools in particular because there's not a whole lot of predators. When the pools dry up in the summer and the fall, um, it means that stuff like fish can't live in the pools, and so you know, for something like a salamander or a frog, fish would be considered a predator to the eggs. Other predators like dragonfly nymphs and some adult newts wouldn't be able to use those pools either if they were drying up at certain times of the year like these vernal pools do. And I like this map too because it kind of shows the maximum distance some of these species that we have will go away from a pool. We have some species like the spotted salamander which don't get a whole lot of movement in, and so they're only going to be found really in the patches of forest closest to the pool. And you have other species down here like the wood frog and our eastern red-spotted newt who can travel thousands of feet away from the pools because they don't need, they can travel further, first of all, but they can also survive away from these water sources for longer periods of time. Um, so, well, I should say during this time of the year when amphibians are migrating, that there's a chance that in between the periods where they do migrate, a road could be built in between where that salamander or frog spends most of the year and where it's breeding in these pools, which means that they're going to be crossing roads, which is why we're going out on these big nights. We want to be able to count them as they cross. But roads at night aren't always the safest places, so we're asking that everybody who shows up to the big night has some sort of light with them, whether that's a headlamp or a flashlight, and a reflective vest. Tin Mount, we have a couple reflective vests at Tin Mountain, but it certainly wouldn't be enough for everybody who wants to participate. So we're asking that you please bring your own. And if you do forget a vest, we have a couple on standby, but bring a vest is a must. And a lot of people often forget to bring rain gear. They're so preoccupied with getting a light and a vest that they'll forget one of the more important aspects for safety that night, and that's just bringing like a nice proper rain jacket and rain pants. I mean, heck, I'm probably going to bring my rain boots as well, just because even though it is around 40 degrees, I mean that's still pretty cold. And lastly, just being road safe. So if somebody spots a car coming, please make everybody aware that a car is on the way, and also just being conscientious with if you're bringing kids out. Just being making sure that they are road safe, and that's why we're also asking that people not bring any kids under the age of 5 um, to the big night as well. But humans aren't the only ones that could be put in danger on a night like this. Amphibians by far are are in harm's way when they're crossing roads. But just to minimize some of the dangers that are involved for the amphibians, we're asking that people please don't put on hand sanitizer or any sort of hand soaps or lotions before picking up any salamanders. Even though those products are fine for our skin, they're pretty toxic for something like a salamander who needs to breathe through their skin. And we're also asking that you minimize handling whenever you do. So that means, um, you could handle the salamander in a plastic bag if you wanted to, if you feel more, if you feel safer with doing that. But that in between holding that salamander, or frog or whatever you happen to catch, and the next amphibian that you end up catching, we please ask that you wash your hands with water, or you can even pick up some leaves and just rub them in your hands. That should be enough to get any any of the particulates from that other amphibian off your hand. For instance, this salamander on the screen is a spring salamander. It might look harmless, but if you pick up a spring salamander and you bring it across a road and then you go to pick up another species of salamander, I mean, that salamander is going to freak out because someone's trying to grab it, but it's also going to freak out because it can smell the spring salamander on you, because spring salamanders are a big predator for a lot of other species of salamander, and small frog. So that should just washing your hands off in water or some sort of like leaf or plant matter is usually enough to be able to get that scent off of you. Um, so that's really all I have to say about amphibian safety, maybe with the minimized handling as well. When you're holding a salamander or a frog, just making sure to get that individual off the road as fast as possible is ideal. So now we're on to my favorite part of the talk, the species that we could expect to see out there on a big night. Broadly speaking, we can split these amphibians into two main groups. We have our salamanders and we have our frogs. I threw newts in with salamanders because they're closely related, and I also threw toads in with frogs. But to start us off, we're going to start with our poster child here for this big night, the spotted salamander. Its scientific name is Ambystoma maculatum. Ambystoma, that salamander group are known as the mole salamanders, and they're called mole salamanders because they spend most of their lives underground. Or the name Ambystoma directly translates to cup-shaped mouth because they have such a big mouth compared to other species. And maculatum directly translates to spotted or speckled. The genus Ambystoma are some of the largest terrestrial salamanders that we have in the eastern United States. In fact, the biggest terrestrial salamander in the country, the tiger salamander, is a member of this genus. The spotted salamander is the biggest salamander that we have here in the Mount Washington Valley. So just following with that trend of usually being pretty large. Ambystoma salamanders are also, they go through two phases throughout their life. They go through an aquatic larval stage. That stage is usually in those vernal pools. And then several months after the egg is hatched, that larval salamander will become an adult and go through the second phase of its life. And usually with Ambystoma salamanders, that can last years. Another interesting fact about Ambystoma salamanders is that they are one of the few salamander groups that have lungs. So many of the salamanders, in fact, pretty much every salamander we'll talk about except one other, are lungless. They respirate exclusively through their skin. These guys can respirate both through their skin and through their lungs. And another really interesting fact is that when they go to these vernal pools, they breed through internal fertilization. Most people think that amphibians are like fish, and that they will deposit their eggs on the bottom of a body of water in a nest, and the males will fertilize the eggs by showering sperm over them. With salamanders, the males will lay a spermatophore, which is a sac of sperm that the female will then take up during the breeding season into her body and will fertilize the eggs internally. Spotted salamanders are most commonly found in woodlands, typically around floodplains where there's lots of vernal pools. And just like every other Ambystoma salamander, these guys go through two phases throughout their life, and they have lungs as well. But yeah, that's the spotted salamander. I think they're pretty awesome, and they should be one of the more common species that we see on Bald Hill Road. Our next salamander is the eastern red-backed salamander. It's in the genus Plethodon, which is the most diverse genus of salamander in the country. The name plethodon is it means many-toothed, and many herpetologists refer to the plethodon salamanders as our woodland salamanders. These species typically are found high up in forests, far away from water. Um, they're one of the few salamander groups that can tolerate more dry conditions. Um, and like I said, plethodon salamanders are a very diverse genus of salamander, and you can find most of these species within this genus in the southern Appalachians, where many of the species are restricted to high elevations. The eastern redbacked is the only plethodon in New Hampshire, so we don't have to worry about anything else that might be confused for it. And I should also mention that the scientific name Cinereus means ash or gray colored. And I find it kind of weird that the scientific name is referring to a gray color while the common name refers to it having a red color. It's actually the scientific name that might be more accurate because along the sides of the salamander, they have these dark sides with, and I know you can't see it in these photos, with kind of an ash or gray speckling along the side. It looks like somebody's literally taken ash from a campfire and kind of just scattered it along the side of the salamander. And why I don't think redbacked is a better name is that you can get salamanders that have more of an orange color like this, which is actually more common than the red. You can get salamanders here that have more of a tan color. And I've seen other individuals that have gray backs and yellow backs. And I've even seen ones that don't really have a color to the back. It's just black. Um, so for the ID for the salamander, they can come in a variety of different back colors, but here at Bald Hill Road, this orange backed salamander is probably going to be the one that's expected. Um, Plethodon are a really interesting group of salamander because I mentioned they can stick further into the woods, a lot further away from water bodies than other groups, because they don't lay their eggs in water. They lay their eggs in moist soils. And when the eggs hatch, they're basically fully formed micro salamanders that are able to go out into the world and eat all the bugs they want. Whereas the other groups of salamanders, when they hatch out of the egg, will have a larval phase before they transition into that adult phase. Um, yeah, that's our eastern redback. One last really interesting fact about the eastern redback is that if you took every eastern redback salamander and you put it in one big bag and you put it on a scale, and you took every white-tailed deer in the eastern United States, you put it on another bag and you put it on the other end of the scale, the eastern redback salamander would be heavier. There are more eastern redback salamanders than any other vertebrate animal in the eastern United States, and they have a higher biomass than any other vertebrate animal. They're a really awesome species, and by far New Hampshire's most common salamander. Our third species of salamander today is the northern two-line salamander. It's in the genus Eurasea, meaning the brook salamanders. And its specific epithet is bislineata, great name because it just means two-lined. So it's our two-lined brook salamander. Um, Pretty good name given that the key ID on the salamanders, it's got two lines that run down the back. But Eurasea, the brook salamanders, they're actually not really that common. There's not that many species in the Northeast or even in Appalachia in general. Where Eurasea finds its stride is in the karst caves of central Texas. Most of those caves down in Texas each have their own unique species of salamander within this genus. A lot of the salamander species down there are completely blind. And in fact, they look more like this larval two-line salamander than the adult. Um, but up here in New England, the northern two-line salamander is one of the only species of the brook salamanders. Um, yeah, and some other, I should mention the habitat for the northern two-lined. So it's within the group of salamanders called the brook salamanders. So as you can imagine, these guys are pretty tied to water. My bet is if we were to go out on Bald Hill Road during the big night and see a northern two-line salamander, it's going to be within the vicinity of some water body or maybe even over a culvert. Um, and these guys also go through a two-phase life cycle like our spotted salamander. They lay their eggs in creeks, and those eggs will hatch into larval salamanders like this. The northern two-lined larval salamander has this paddle-shaped tail, and you can't really see it that well because they're pressed up against the body, but on each side of the neck here are a pair of external gills that allow the salamander to breathe underwater. When after a few months to even over a year, this larval salamander will metamorphosize into this adult. The adults are generally a bright yellow color with these two distinct, very neat looking stripes down the back. Those stripes will continue down about halfway down the trail or the tail before they kind of peter out. Um, yeah, and that's about it for the northern two-line. They're very much they're a lot like the next salamander we're going to talk about, the northern dusky. They're actually pretty closely related. The northern dusky salamander, though, is in another genus called Desmognathus, the dusky salamanders. And the specific epithet for the northern dusky means northern. Fuscus means northern. So great name overall. And the desmogs or the duskies are a really interesting group. They're a lot like the plethodon in that their most biodiverse area, the most biodiverse area for duskies is in the southern Appalachians. But where it differs from plethodon is that these guys are again tied more to water bodies. So the plethodon woodland salamanders, like our red-backed, they tend to speciate because they're going up in elevation and they're isolated between mountain peaks. The northern dusky salamander, and I should mention the whole genus Desmognathus, becomes speciated depending on the watershed that salamander species inhabits. The northern dusky salamander is pretty well known to exhibit the speciation. Um, just in the past 5 years, I believe there's been three other species that have been split from the northern dusky salamander just based on genetic evidence. In the southern half of its range, we have our southern dusky salamander. We also have spotted dusky salamander and the Virginia dusky salamander, which aren't found in New Hampshire but have been split apart from the northern dusky salamander. Um, and there's been a paper that has come out recently that suggests that there's another 13 species of northern dusky salamander that have yet to have been split. So could see a lot more species of northern dusky come out, but my bet in New Hampshire is we're just going to see the one stick. For the ID for the northern dusky salamander, it's probably our most bland looking salamander that we could find. They typically are some sort of brown. The lighter the individual, like this one on the left side, typically the lighter they are, the younger they are. And as they age, they become darker, like this individual on the right. And I've even seen northern dusky salamanders almost black just because of how old they are. The only other salamander that I think that could be misidentified for the northern dusky is our northern two-lined, because although the northern two-lined, they average more of a yellow, you could see that maybe a younger one that's just coming out of this larval phase might be a little bit darker, and might look a little bit more like this individual or maybe this one on the right, especially since it has two lines. But you can tell these two species apart because the northern dusky salamander, and I'm sorry that the photo doesn't really show it, it's got this pale line right here that goes from the back of the eye to the back of the jaw. The two line isn't going to have that pale line right there. And also with the northern dusky, the back legs are generally much thicker than the front legs. With the two lined, that difference in size is just barely noticeable. You can definitely notice it in this photo, or these two individuals on screen. And then lastly, and this is kind of morbid, if you cut the tail of the northern dusky salamander and you looked at the cross section, it would resemble more of a triangle shape. You can see there's a ridge along the top of the tail here. Whereas with the northern two-lined, if you were to cut a cross section of that adult northern two-lined, it would look more round in shape. Other than that, maybe you could, like, I could see people confusing this individual with a two line because of the two lines. But you can see the lines go all the way down the length of the tail here. Whereas on our northern two lines, those two lines will start to patter out or pitter out by the mid-length of the tail. And that's about it for northern dusky. I will also mention that these guys are tied to water bodies. I typically don't find them more than 20 or 30 feet away from a creek. So if that helps with the ID on the big night. Our northern spring salamander is one of our last salamanders we'll talk about tonight. The scientific name is Gyrinophilus porphyriticus, and with all the other genuses I've mentioned tonight, there's a ton of different species within them. Gyrinophilus is a little different. It's only got two species within it. It's got the Kentucky spring salamander, native to the southern Appalachians, and it's got this northern spring salamander, which is found from the southern Appalachians all the way north to central New England. These guys, like the northern dust, could be confused with the northern dusky salamander, just because they do average a little bit brown in color. In fact, the two photos here of the same salamander on the same day, just showing kind of the differences in lighting that lighting can have on the photo quality here. My best tip on how to identify the northern spring salamander is if you see what looks like a bratwurst crossing the road, it's more than likely a northern spring salamander. You can see this guy kind of looks a little bit more like a sausage. Over here we got a more hot dog looking salamander just based on the color. So that I would say that's my best ID. Another way to separate dusky from spring is that if you look at the tail on this guy, it's more paddle shaped. It's a lot more like a crocodile or an alligator. It's just got more of a paddle shape to it. So if you cut it at a cross section, it would probably look like an oval with points at the end. And then outside of that, I did talk about the spring salamander and that it loves to eat other salamander species. And I mean, if anything shows uh, one reason why they love salamanders, they get pretty big. I mean, this is one of the biggest salamanders, and it's probably the biggest, second only to spotted, that we'll have on Bald Hill. They're also pretty uncommon, so if we do get one, that's a pretty rare find, I'd say. Um, and I'll also mention, I was saying that they hunt other salamander species. One researcher, I believe, was out of Ohio State, decided that he wanted to figure out how this spring salamander was so successful in eating large worms, insects, and salamanders. And so they were testing out a bunch of ideas, and they thought maybe these lines between the salamander's eye and the tip of the nose have something to do with how the salamander is able to catch food. So he decided to paint over those lines, and sure enough, when he painted over them, the salamander was missing all the prey that was placed in front of it. So those lines are literally like gun sights that the salamander uses to hone in on its prey. It's a pretty interesting fact about the northern spring. The four-toed salamander, this is one of my favorites. Like the redback, the four-toed salamander can be found pretty far away from water. They don't need it as much. In fact, you can see just based on this photo, it's got more dry, like more of a dry skinned look appearance or look to it than any of the other salamanders we've talked about tonight. It's in the genus Hemidactylum, and it's the only member of its genus. It's yeah, the only species within the genus. The specific epithet is scutatum, which I believe is referring to the shape of the back. It almost looks like there's scutes of an alligator or a turtle on the back of the salamander. It's also got a lot of these grooves on the side of it. A couple of the other salamanders that I've shown tonight have these grooves. You can see it here on the side of the salamander here. These are known as costal grooves, and they actually help increase the surface area of the salamander's skin so it can breathe more efficiently. It's a pretty interesting fact about salamanders. These guys are, again, lungless, so they need that surface area. I typically find them in woodlands, but preferably they prefer areas around bogs. That's where they breed. So many of the other salamander species will breed directly in the water. These guys actually breed in moss that's overhanging water in bogs. And what happens is that when the eggs hatch, the larvae literally fall into the water. And that's where they're going to start the first phase of their life before they become these adult terrestrial salamanders. So they have a pretty specific habitat type. And Tin Mountain has some of these bogs that I think could support four-toed populations. So that's why I threw it on here, just in case anybody was able to find one. So how do you ID this salamander from the other species we've talked about? They have a brown back, so it's a little bit like the dusky. It's way too small for a spring salamander, and it's even smaller than I've seen most dusky salamanders. But the key for me is that they have this dry skin appearance, and then I don't know if you guys can notice it on this photo, but around the base of the tail, where the tail meets the body, you can see it here too. There's almost an hourglass shape where the tail almost looks like it's about to pinch itself off. It's a really unique shape. I've never seen it on any other salamander species. But what might even be just as characteristic is this white belly with this black polka dot appearance, very Dalmatian looking. You see that on any salamander, and it immediately identifies it as a four-toed. This is another thing I've just never seen on a salamander before. Um, yeah, that's our four-toed salamander. And our last salamander we'll talk about is our eastern red-spotted newt. The scientific name is Notothalamus viridescens. I believe the viridescence refers to like the greenish color on the adults, but not completely sure. Notothalamus is our North American newts. There's quite a few species in the eastern United States within the genus, but the only one native to New Hampshire is the eastern red-spotted. One really interesting thing about newts that I'm sure some of you guys probably already know is that unlike the other salamanders, these guys go through three phases in their life cycle. They go through an aquatic larval stage, which I don't have pictured, but then they go into this terrestrial, like juvenile phase where they become really bright orange. That orange is to deter predators. It's kind of a signal showing that it's poisonous, which it is. And they're one of the only diurnal salamanders that we have. I'm sure many of you have seen these Fs walking around or hiking around the valley. They typically are out early in the morning, late in the evening, or during rain events or during fog events. After going through this juvenile phase for a couple of years, in which they can wander thousands of feet away from their water bodies, they come back to those water sources as this adult. This is when it graduates back to the water. It becomes almost fully aquatic. It grows this long paddle-shaped tail. It becomes dark green to camouflage it in with the algae where it likes to prey on invertebrates. And it is significantly larger than the juvenile phase here. Though on our big night, we'll probably only encounter these juvenile ones. This is what's going to be crossing the road for us. Yeah, what could be confused too is a lot of people say these are different than salamanders, and I mean they are. But the original salamanders were newts. The family for the newt is Salamandridae, just showing where that root came from, because these guys are pretty common in Europe where they were first discovering salamanders and naming them. Yeah, and that's about it for the eastern. Oh, I should mention too with the newt, if you pick up one of these guys, this is one of those species that you definitely want to wash your hands after. They are toxic, and that poison I've heard can rub off on your skin. It's not anything that would be serious, but it could potentially harm you if you put it on your eye, or if you for some reason decided to put your hand in your mouth. So just go to the nearest creek or water body and wash your hands off. That's usually enough to get anything off your hands. We have our first frog, the spring peeper. I should have brought up the calls for you. I'll pull it up while I'm talking, but it's within the genus Pseudacarus. It's an interesting genus because if any of you know your Latin roots, pseud or pseudo means false. But you might not know what acris means, and that literally translates to, or at least from that I know of, translates to cricket frog. So the genus literally means fake cricket frog, but we can call them our chorus frogs. Chorus frogs are a type of tree frog. A lot of people don't know it, but spring peepers are a tree frog. The scientific epithet here, crucifer, refers to the cross shape on the back of the peeper. This is a really good way to identify this frog species. I have never seen a frog that has this X on the back. And so whenever I see a small tree frog looking guy hopping on the ground, I can assume it is a peeper based off of this cross. Their habitat, so it changes seasonally, but in the spring around now, these guys start migrating en masse to their local water bodies. But late in the summer after breeding, these guys will start moving up into the forest. And I've heard these guys here at Tin Mountain all the way up until early December calling from within our woodlots around the center. When they do make it to water bodies, males will set up territories in which their calls can be almost deafening. I mean, I think they've recorded the calls being louder than ambulances. They're pretty amazing little frogs. And they're our smallest frog species native to New Hampshire. I'm going to play the call for you guys, even though I'm sure you've heard of it. Can you guys hear that? Thumbs up. Yeah, they're pretty awesome. During the big night, we will be seeing these guys. I will put money down that we will see peepers, and if we're really struggling to see them, I know we'll 100% be hearing them. This is one of our most common species of frog. Next up, we have the gray tree frog. This is a species that comes out a little bit later in the season than spring peeper. If any of you have stayed out on a porch late in the evening, you've probably heard gray tree frogs calling from the canopy. Um, their call is pretty unique. They might sound most like a raccoon chirping, or I think red-headed woodpeckers sound a lot like gray tree frogs. Um, these guys are found all across the eastern United States, just like our peeper. It's within the genus Hyla, which is a genus that incorporates pretty much all native North American tree frogs. And its scientific name is versicolor. These guys are commonly confused with a species that you can find further south called the Cope's gray tree frog, which looks basically identical. The only way you can separate them is based on genetics and a little bit based on call. I think Cope's gray tree frog has got one extra chromosome, which just basically in the end means that Cope's gray tree frogs can't mate with our regular gray tree frogs. And they're so similar in how they look that I tried to dupe you guys and I put two Cope's gray tree frogs on screen instead of the regular gray tree frog, just to make a point of how similar they look. Um, just like Cope's gray tree frog, our regular gray tree frog can come in two different color types. We have this gray color and we have a green, more of a greenish color. And unlike the peeper, I think these guys have a little bit more of a specific niche when it comes to where they lay their eggs. These guys will lay their eggs in really shallow water bodies. And I've even heard of them laying eggs in little like collections of water that happen within like the bark or within a hollow out tree way up in the canopy. So they'll lay their eggs just about anywhere. And to show you what these guys sound like, because I just love it so much, we got to add. I'll just talk through it. And this is our only other tree frog that we can find here in New Hampshire. Here, the ad is just stopped. So pretty awesome call. I love it. Wood frog, Lithobates sylvaticus. The wood frog is in the genus Lithobates, which is our North American wood frogs or pond frogs. A lot of different species that you'll encounter across the country are within this genus. And for a while, they considered these North American pond frogs, like the wood frog, to be really closely related with the pond frogs over in Europe and Asia. They were within the same genus for a while, but now our North American ones have been separated and they're within their own genus Lithobates. Sylvaticus pretty much means forest or woodland, so the name almost directly translates to the common name. These guys, like the peeper, also kind of move between habitats. Throughout the year, you can find them typically in woodlands, great name for the frog that's found in woodlands, and then it'll migrate to these ephemeral or vernal pools in early spring. I should mention too that the wood frog is one of the earliest frogs to wake up in the spring. And I'm sure many of you know this as well, but the wood frog literally freezes solid during the winter. It uses a special antifreeze compound that it throws out through it, that it puts out through its entire body in the fall. So when it does freeze up in the winter, the cells aren't damaged. And because of that, it is the northernmost frog species in North America, reaching up into central Alaska. So it gets pretty far north. These guys, I'm surprised I haven't heard any yet, but we're getting to about the time when wood frogs are going to be out calling. Um, they're really, I think they look really similar to the next frog that we're going to talk about. But one way to ID it apart from that next frog is that they have no patterning on the back. And another way to ID it is they have this big black robber mask around the eye. And you can see this individual is a little bit more red, but that color around the eye is still darker than the rest of the back. You can see it really well on this one right here. Um, and then they also have this really distinct white lip appearance. The next frog species also has that white lip, but it'll help with the frog species that we talk about afterward. When we're out on the big night, I highly suspect we'll be hearing and seeing wood frogs around. And they also have a pretty distinct call. Let's see if this works. Does kind of these triplet calls. That one was a double, but it'll call multiple times. Um, Unlike some of the other frogs too, which kind of inflate their throat sac, these guys inflate two sacs on the side of their cheek, so it'll kind of come out from the side. It's just an interesting fact about the wood frog. The next frog is our pickerel frog. It's in the genus Lithobates, just like the wood frog. The specific epithet is palustris, also meaning of the woods. I usually think of palustris as maybe being more of like a forested woodland, or sorry, a forested wetland. But unlike the wood frog, you can identify pickerel frogs by the spotting on the side. They have stripes on their thighs too. There's patterning here. On the wood frog, there's just not really a whole lot. These guys are commonly confused with leopard frogs, which are around, but they're very rare. But you can identify them apart from the leopard frog based on the spotting on the back here. The pickerel frog is going to have these rectangular blobs that are always paired up with one that's on the other side of the body. So we can see there's a pair here and maybe another pair of blobs here. On the leopard frog, the back is going to look a lot more like a leopard print. So that helps. Pickerel frog has got these rectangles. Leopard frogs have got a leopard print. So if you see any pickerel frogs with leopard prints on the back during the big night, that is something to let us know about. We'd love to know about a northern leopard frog hanging around. Like the wood frog, they have this really nice clean white lip. It's not as extensive as the wood frog, but it's still there. You can definitely still see it, and it doesn't have that robber mask appearance that the wood frog has. They're called.
What causes sensitivity?
Got another ad. Um, the pickerel frog, an interesting fact about them is that they also have a toxin on their skin, just like the newt. It is not harmful to humans, but like I said with the newt, I wouldn't pick up a pickerel frog and immediately put my hands in my mouth. The toxin is supposed to be meant for other frogs. There's a really unfortunate story of a herpetologist who was collecting frogs during a sampling night, and he put all the frogs in a bucket. And at the end of the night, when he was putting the frogs back out, he noticed that a lot of them had died, and one of the only ones that was still living in the bucket was this pickerel frog, just because of how toxic it was to the skin of other frog species. Here, I'll play the call for you guys. Kind of a growl. It's got a growl-like call. These guys will be out a little bit later in the season. My guess is probably more towards mid to late April is when these guys will first start showing up on the landscape, but they probably wouldn't start getting going during the breeding cycle and in any sort of big numbers until like mid-May is my guess. Green frog versus bullfrog. These are our last two species of the night, or last two frogs of the night. These guys are commonly confused with one another. They are very closely related, and they're both within the genus Lithobates. These are our bigger pond frogs, and they're the frogs that we're talking about within this genus that actually live up to their name. They are pond frogs. The green frog is a little bit more of a generalist. I've often found green frogs way high up in woodlands before as they're migrating on these big nights. Bullfrogs usually stick close to those water bodies, and they love ponds as well. You can see this guy's even in a tire rut right here. Um, the best way to ID these two species are the calls. The green frog sounds like a banjo being plucked, is the best way I know it. It's like an out-of-tune banjo. Um, the bullfrog has got more of, I think, a classic frog type call. Let's see. Right there. That's what I imagine when I'm at a retention pond in the summer and it's like right around the evening, hearing that. So that one's more of like a roving call. It's not like the pluck of the green frog. So you can identify them based off the calls, but we're probably not going to be hearing green and bullfrogs calling when we're out and about on a big night. So the way we're going to identify them is based off of these folds around their eardrum. The eardrum on frogs is known as the tympanum. It's not really an eardrum, but it's basically the frog's equivalent of one. And both the green and the bullfrog have these folds. On the green frog, the fold wraps around the tympanum, but it also there's a branch out that comes down the back. You can see it here too, that branch that comes out down the back of the frog. This is known as a mid-lat a midlateral fold, I believe. You don't have to know that fact. I'm just but it's got these two folds that come down. One of them wraps around the tympanum, one of them goes down the back, and the bullfrog's fold just kind of wraps around the tympanum here. You can see it really well in this individual. It doesn't have the stripe down the back. It's just got that one fold. And our last animal we're talking about tonight is the American toad, Anaxyrus americanus. Now, Anaxyrus went through a very similar thing as Lithobates. Anaxyrus toads they used to be a part of the same group of toads that you could find over in Europe and Asia, which were in the genus Bufo, which literally translates to toad. But recently, it's been found that these North American toads are separate genetically, and so they renamed the North American toads and put them in the genus Anaxyrus. You can imagine that Americanus translates to American. So the scientific name literally or translates directly to American toad. These guys, unlike the other frogs, will lay their eggs in like the most vernal of vernal pools. I mean, they'll lay their eggs basically in puddles. In fact, these larval American toads that I took a picture of, they're literally in a puddle on the side of the road. I think it was a tire rut. But they will lay their eggs in these really quickly these these bits of water that can quickly dry out. And I should have mentioned too that frogs do reproduce through external fertilization. So unlike the salamanders, the females will lay their eggs in the water, and the males will deposit sperm on top of the eggs to fertilize them. And the toad egg sacs are actually, you can identify toad egg sacs over frog egg sacs because the toad egg sacs create a double helix look, almost like DNA, this spiraling appearance. It's really pretty. I won't go into the ID too much with the American toad, because I think most people know how to identify the American toad from a frog. And because it's the only toad here in the Mount Washington Valley, you don't really have to run into any issues with that. The call is like this. It's a pretty extensive trill. It's the only like frog that I know of that does a sort of long trill like that. The only other species of toad that comes close to the American toad here in the Mount Washington Valley is a Fowler's toad, and I believe they're found in southern New Hampshire, so you wouldn't find them this far north. So there's no other toads that you can confuse with the American toad here. And these guys should be out on a big night as well. These guys wake up a little early. They typically won't breed until May, but they'll still start moving earlier in the season. And I think with that, that kind of wraps it up for the species. Um, Lastly, I do want to mention that we have iNaturalist. Now, a lot of you probably live throughout the Mount Washington Valley, and we're asking that if you live in a place like Jackson or further away from Albany, that you might want to stick around your own area and just try to do a big night on your own local patch. And a good way to document some of the species that you could see in that local patch is an app like iNaturalist. It's completely free, and it's a great community science initiative that was started where you can just take pictures of whatever you find, and it automatically, when you take a photo of it, will there's an AI software built into the app that will identify that species for you. Now, it's not always right, but that's even when it's wrong, other people can chime in on the ID and try to support it, or maybe they disagree with it. But I find this is a great tool to use. And if you wanted to do a big night in your own area, you could use iNaturalist to help you with the identifications, and then you could send us an email with a link to those observations on iNaturalist. And what's also interesting is if you have any people around your area that might be interested in seeing whatever animal that you observed, they don't they can look at iNaturalist and know just how far they have to go to be able to see whatever species it is that they want to. So iNaturalist, it's a great tool. I can't say enough about it. I can definitely take questions about iNaturalist. I've been using my account for about 10 years now. It's a pretty sweet little bit of software. And that about wraps it. If you have any contact or if you have any questions that you can't think of tonight that you'd love to ask me or Katie, feel free to reach out to us. We'll be happy to answer those questions for you. Thank you. I can answer any questions you have now.
All right, Logan, thank you so much. That was fabulous, and a number of the comments in our chat echo that. Do we want to take the last little bit of this to talk a little bit about, I mean, I know we went over, and Katie, you can chime in here too. I know you went over safety and some of sort of the FAQs, but you know, essentially at this point, as you know, Logan said at the beginning of the presentation, we can't really predict until, you know, a day or two before. We might have an idea looking at the forecast when we get that first warm, wet night when it will be, but our plan at this point will be for everyone who has sent us their contact information to be on our on-call, you know, Salamander Brigade. You know, we will send an email out as soon as we, you know, we might send one out saying it looks like it's going to be this date. And then when we confirm that, but do you, Logan and Katie, do you want to talk a little bit about more just the logistics of what that might look like?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to mention really quick, I forgot to mention at the beginning of the program, there's been a lot of good photos in this presentation, like this wood frog that's taken by a really good friend of mine who does a lot of amphibian photography in Maryland. His name is Josh Ward, so all credit to him for sending some of these photos over. Really, I just really enjoyed them. But yeah, for the big night, Katie, we're not going to send an email out probably until the morning before, just because we
Yes.
don't know the conditions until then.
Yeah, so my thinking is that we maybe a couple days before, when it's looking like it would potentially be a good night, we'll send a message out to just say that this might be the week, and then confirm morning of to the group. And so yeah, people on this call are interested. We have an email list that we've been sending everything out to. So if you want to just send me an email, my email's on the screen there, to get added to that list, then I can put you on there and let you know when we're about to do it. But so yeah, well, like Nora said, it's probably going to be one of those things where we don't necessarily know until the day of. So we'll try our best to give people some kind of advanced warning, but it could very well just be the day of. And then our thinking is that we'll have people meet at the Nature Learning Center in Albany probably around 6:30, and then head out along Bald Hill Road. And then I also see in the chat a question about what we'd actually be doing on the big night. And so, that question is, are we documenting what we see or just helping the amphibians cross? And so our plan is to do both. Since this is our first year doing this, we are going to just try to keep kind of a rudimentary tally. And so we'll decide the night of, depending on how many people are there, whether we're just going to have one person trying to keep a basic tally of like how many different species and how many individuals of species we see, or maybe a few people. But I mean, the main goal is to just help the guys across. And then, yeah, record what kind of data, whatever kind of data we can.
All right, fabulous. If anyone has questions, you can either put them in the chat now, or if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself. You know, as I had said, I don't know if all of you had joined, but you know, Tin Mountain has been participating in the Christmas bird count for 34 years at this point, and we have a very devoted group of volunteers that help with that, and we are looking to expand our community science offerings, so ways that we as community members can essentially be crowdsourced and help gather data. So we're looking both to expand the number of programs that we're offering, as well as sort of a diversity of species groups that that we are working with. So many of you also have been on emails or have seen that we're participating in a butterfly count this July. So as I said, looking for various ways for for residents and visitors of the area to help participate in in larger research projects. So I would say that if you're interested, I mean, you really don't need don't need a massive skill set, and even if you can't identify your amphibians, you are still welcome and encouraged to participate. And if you don't live within close proximity of our Nature Learning Center in Albany, as Logan said, all of these techniques, these ID skills, if you taking these next, this next week or so to really identify where are, these possible water bodies, and road crossings, and, and going out on your own, safely with reflective gear and headlamps, but going out and and seeing, even if you don't want to help them cross, I mean, it's fun just to go out and see this see this annual event take place. It's pretty neat thing to experience. All right, with that, do we have anything else to add, Logan or Katie?
I had a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, Jill, go ahead.
Hi. So if I was to do it in my area, being Glen,
Yeah,
would the big night be the same night?
Most likely, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, you could be on the email list, and we'll send that out, and it will likely be the same night. And I will say, some years there's like a very distinct big night. And some years it's kind of a trickle and a wave, where you don't get like really that perfect temperature and precipitation combination. And so it's kind of like a lot of a number of smaller events.
Medium nights.
Yes. Just nights. So
Yeah, it's a regular.
there are big nights, and then there are just average nights. Yeah, so so much of that is just dictated by the weather. But yes, you can certainly get on our list. You know, with that said, if you happen to live in, you know, the Boston area, our big night, you know, call is, you know, our decision is probably going to be after, you know, big nights in, you know, in southern New England. But you know, if you're in this general area, it should probably be around that same night.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I should mention too that pretty much any extended rain period between now or between when the big night should happen in like the next couple weeks and in like August is going to have amphibians moving too. It just won't be as highly trafficked by like as many species as the big night will be. So if you wanted to get out in June or July, you'll probably find some stuff moving around too.
All right, perfect. Well, with that, again, Logan, thank you so much for putting that presentation together. And I would say, again, if anyone is not currently on our list who would like to be, you can email Logan, you can email Katie, you can email myself. We will get you on that list and keep you updated in this process.
I did